The Impact of Exploration, Africa and Asia, Unit 6. Let's do a brief review first. The European nations began exploring because they wanted to get gold, glory, and spread religion. The nations were motivated to find new trade routes and had the technology to support long-distance oceanic travel. Without these factors, exploration wouldn't have been possible. European exploration created an exchange of foods, animals, and diseases known as the Columbian Exchange. This exchange had a dramatic impact on the diet, culture, and survival of the people affected. Here you see a diagram of the Columbian Exchange, and you can see the things that came from Africa, Asia, and Europe into the Americas as a result of exploration. And you can also see the things that came from the Americas back to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Make sure that you're familiar not only with this concept, but that you could give examples of the types of things that were exchanged between the different societies. Another concept that goes along with the idea of European exploration is triangular trade. And the triangle part of this describes the trade pattern among Europe, Africa, and the Americas. You can see in the diagram at the right that Europe traded guns, cloth, and gold in order to acquire slaves in Africa. Those slaves were then brought to the Americas via a route called the Middle Passage and were sold for tobacco, sugar, molasses, and cotton. These resources or raw materials were taken back to Europe and they were turned into finished goods that were then sold for a profit back in the colonies. This is what is triangular trade. The impact of exploration in Africa. The most dramatic impact has to do with slavery. It's estimated that as many as 10 million men, women, and children were brought out of Africa as slaves in the period from the 1500s to the 1700s. As stated previously, the movement of slaves from Africa to the Americas occurred along a route known as the Middle Passage, and this voyage with people just packed into these ships resulted in a high death rate of people being transported from Africa to the Americas. It's also true that there are regions of Africa that were literally depopulated by the slave trade, and the youngest, strongest people were removed from all of these villages, which impacted not only the people who were being removed, but the quality of life for the people remaining in the villages. The slave exportation also increased warfare in Africa. Coastal regions would go to war against interior areas so that slaves could be captured from the interior areas to meet the demands of the European slave traders. All of this resulted in a destruction of traditional culture. African people, to some extent, lost faith in their gods and in their religious practices because this horrible thing was happening to them, and it also resulted in the decline of the creation of works of art. So while it's true that slavery was known in Africa previous to European exploration, it's this type of slavery which results in the exportation of slaves from the continent across the ocean that is so devastating to Africa. In fact, a Dutch slave trader commented about the impact of European exploration and slavery on Africa. From us, he says, talking about Africa, they've learned strife, quarreling, drunkenness, trickery, theft, unbridled desire for what is not one's own, misdeeds unknown to them before, and the accursed lust for gold. Kind of summarizes how damaging the slave trade and European exploration was to the African cultures. Additionally, you can see that three types of government emerge in Africa during this time period. There are kingdoms that have tight central control and a strong leader. There are smaller individual states that are loosely bound together under a king. And then there are small independent villages. All three types of government were affected by the slave trade. Traditional trade routes shifted away from the interior regions that were used in ancient times and out to the coast, where the slave markets were located. There was limited religious impact in terms of missionaries coming into Africa in this time period. Most of the northern areas remained loyal to Islam, where they had converted sometimes hundreds of years ago. There were some small gains for Christian missionaries in South Africa and in Ethiopia, which already had a Christian tradition, but otherwise missionaries are not very successful in Africa in this time period. In terms of the impact of exploration in Asia, remember that Asia was the original destination of the explorers. They were looking for trade routes so that they could access spices and other goods. On the mainland areas in Asia, many areas were ethnically, linguistically, that means by language, and culturally united under kings with central authority. The establishment of trade relations and posts and the influence of Christian and Muslim missionaries was very limited in these areas, as Buddhism continued to spread across the continent in terms of the dominant religion. The story was different in island and coastal locations in Asia, where there was a more direct effect. Muslim traders introduced Islam to this region and gained control of many trade routes. And the English and the Dutch, the people from the Netherlands, were particularly successful, as they were able to seize areas in the Indonesian islands and along the Malay Peninsula in order to establish trading posts and forts. And it was in these areas that missionaries introduced Christianity with some success. This sums up the impact of exploration in Africa and Asia. If you need to rewind or rewatch any portion of this video, please feel free to do so. Thanks for listening.